أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين بارئ الخلائق أجمعين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين المبعوث رحمة للعالمين شفيع المذنبين وحبيب قلوب الصادقين سيدنا ومولانا أبي القاسم محمد
اللهم صل على محمد
وعلى أهل بيته الأطيبين الأطهرين الهداة المهديين ولعنة الله على أعدائهم إلى قيام يوم الدين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي أما بعد فقد قال أمير المؤمنين علي بن أبي طالب عليه الصلاة والسلام قد هلك في اثنان محب غال ومبغض قال صلوات الله
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
Dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Yesterday we mentioned the 5 categories of Muslims with regards to their relationship to Ahlul Bayt. And the categorization is meant to facilitate an understanding of our relationship with the rest of the Muslim community. If you want to be more precise, you can maybe even make additional categories within every category. But the 5 general categories are: there were some people who had an intrinsic animosity to Ahlul Bayt. They didn't like to hear mention of the virtues of Ahlul Bayt. They had an animosity towards them because of who they were and because of their relationship to the Prophet and what they represented for Islam. The second category is those who didn't have any intrinsic opposition to Ahlul Bayt, and they may even have been followers of Imam Ali for a time. But then because they said that we're going to use our logic and not follow the logic of the Imam, they separated their path from the path of the Imam. They didn't have any animosity, but they had an ignorance which caused them to think that they are to understand Islam on their own terms. In the time of Imam Ali, that was often with regard to warfare. They said, let's have peace and not allow Muslims to fight one another. Although sometimes having a battle at the right time prevents many more battles and a much longer conflict over many generations. And because people didn't listen to Imam Ali, and from the very verge of victory, the army of the Imam rebelled against him, Muawiyah was not defeated. And the fitna that Muawiyah created lasted in the Muslim world directly for almost 100 years. And the effects of that fitna are still being felt today. So the second group was equally damaging, or perhaps more damaging for the Muslim Ummah. The third group is those people who don't have any particular love for Ahlul Bayt. They don't have any particular relationship of obedience to Ahlul Bayt, but they don't have any animosity either. And some people might think that this is the Sunni view, that this is historically not the majority Sunni view at all. It is outside of the mainstream of Islam. It has become more common in the present time, largely because of propaganda, largely because of money and because of bribes. But otherwise, even now in most parts of the Muslim world, people's hearts are not like that. The evidence of this is that you will find some people who praise Muawiyah and praise Yazid. There is a famous sentence, قُتِلَ الْحُسَيْنُ بِسَيْفِ جَدِّهِ نَعُوذُ بِاللَّهِ. Imam Hussein was killed with the sword of his own grandfather. The meaning of that sentence is that Yazid was, God forbid, the rightful successor of the Prophet. And so his sword was the sword of the Prophet. His battle was the battle of the Prophet. And Imam Hussein, na'udhu billah, was a rebel. And so it was the religion of his grandfather and it was the authority of his grandfather that was against Imam Hussein in Karbala. This group, they may have a love for Imam Hussein, but they will say he was wrong. Some of you may have heard, and I don't normally name people but because it's a very common issue, a conference on Karbala that was organized by a scholar in the Sunni community, Yasir Qadi. Entire conference, and you can find it online if you're interested. And in that conference he says that we love Ahlul Bayt, we love Imam Hussein. It was a tragedy that he was killed. But the tragedy was of his own doing. Because there were people like Abdullah ibn Zubayr who also had objections, but they didn't fight against Yazid in that way. Although Abdullah ibn Zubayr, they also have an awkward relationship because he did rebel against Yazid. And then he said there was Abdullah ibn Umar. He was in Medina and he didn't like Yazid and he didn't like what Yazid did. But he said, I will prefer the unity of the Muslim Ummah over everything else. And then in that conference he says explicitly that I love Imam Hussein. If only Imam Hussein had been as wise as Abdullah ibn Umar. Na'uzubillah. He wouldn't have been martyred, blood would not have been shed, everything would have been wonderful. And the tragedy is that if you find that the Muslim world is always governed by dictatorships, it is because of that same philosophy. That it might be Yazid who is our governor, but we don't want to have bloodshed. We're going to have peace. Our rights may be trampled, our identity may be trampled, our money may be taken, our dignity may be fought against, but we're going to listen and we're going to obey. It's not that people in the Muslim world don't have those same human desires that every other people have. It's not that they don't have the intellect or the wisdom to know that an oppressive government is unjust, but it is because they have a false religious message that tells them, ignore your rights and ignore your human needs, and the greatest value in an Islamic society is not to have bloodshed and to have a Khalifa who claims to be Muslim. Now, some people might say, if only Imam Hussein had been like Abdullah ibn Umar, his blood would not have been shed. It's an expression of love for Imam Hussein. But how different is that from the perspective of those who say, thank God Imam Hussein was not like those other people in the Muslim Ummah, because he gave every Muslim and even non-Muslims an inspiring guidance of how to face insurmountable odds and stand up for what is right through principle and through sacrifice. You don't even have to be a Muslim to say that it is only Imam Hussein who in that generation and in all generations is an inspiring example of dignity and courage that every human being can relate to and can be inspired by. So this is the third group. This is actually a minority. And the reason that you can see it as a minority is the very fact that even people who may admire Yazid or Muawiyah, they often have to hide it. And they will say things like, for example, Yazid was not responsible for the martyrdom of Imam Hussein. Not because they care. They might actually name their children Yazid. The reason why they say that is because they know that the Muslims would never be able to have any relationship of affection for Yazid if they believe he is the one who killed Imam Hussein. So the mainstream of Islam is in the last two groups. Not intrinsic hatred for Ahlul Bayt, not animosity because they disagreed with Ahlul Bayt, and not keeping Ahlul Bayt just for love without any kind of practical effect for that relationship. This fourth group is the mainstream in the Sunni community. They have a real love for Ahlul Bayt, but they don't understand or they don't agree with the Shia on all of the implications of that love, which is to have animosity against the enemies of Ahlul Bayt. And the fifth group is what we believe to be the proper principle. Love for the Prophet means that you dislike the enemies of the Prophet. And love for Ahlul Bayt means that you search out and find who were the enemies of Ahlul Bayt. And then you dissociate from them and from everything that they represented in opposition to Ahlul Bayt alayhi salatu wassalam. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Now the point is, why do we care? There's 5 groups. Why can't we all just say that we're all Muslims? Especially if one of those other groups, they pray and they fast, and if they're a good person and they're charitable and they're nice to their family, they're nice to their friends, if they're willing to give me the right to practice my religion, and I will be giving them the right to practice their religion, and we can all respectfully agree to disagree, why should we care? Why does it matter whether one principle is right or another principle is right? Should we have any kind of loyalty to what we believe that will cause us to be somewhat antagonistic towards others? And this is something that our society in America does not properly understand. General culture in America does not sufficiently recognize how damaging it is to everyone's well-being when there is a false belief system that is affirmed and that is promulgated by any one person in society. So if I have a false belief, if I'm a racist, if I am prejudiced against foreigners, I might have freedom of speech, and that is its own issue of how much that speech should be encouraged or permitted. But there is an effect of my speech on you. It can create a culture which puts vulnerable people at risk of harm. And we care about what is right, not to restrict other people's freedom of speech, not to restrict other people's freedom of religion, but because as Muslims we recognize that alongside that principle, there is a very real harm that comes to every member of society, most importantly those who are weak and vulnerable. When people say things that are fundamentally unjust. Just to give you an example, all of the things that people are complaining about now in America under the current administration, not one of them is new. There are immigrants who are being put like animals or worse than animals in holding cells, and then families that are being separated from their children and sent out of the country. There is no doubt that if puppies were separated from their mothers, if dogs were separated from their puppies, in this way, you would have protests in every city in this country. As somebody who works in the media, if you have a post about human beings being killed, and you have a post about somebody abusing an animal, which one will get more attention? Which one will get more outrage? I had heard from somebody who worked in newspapers back when newspapers were still commonly circulating, that sometimes their newsroom would get voluntary calls that tell me about this dog that we heard has been separated from its owners. Is there a relief fund that we can donate to? And we would get hundreds or thousands of dollars of voluntary donations for a dog that doesn't need any money because it's already found another home. But somebody heard it's abandoned. And then you have a story that hundreds of people are vulnerable in some part of the world or even in this country, children. And not one call will come in that can I donate a soup can to help that child. This is a tragedy, and all of us, in some way, bear a responsibility towards that. It's happening in our country. But all of this was present under the previous administration as well. Those holding cells are not new. Trump did not make them. They were there before. The separation of families was there before. Even the ban on immigrants that is based on regulations that were in existence before. The war crimes that were committed, that were not prosecuted, they were there before. And the official policy was we're going to look forward, not look backwards. So it's very easy to reinstate when the previous injustices were not made right. The point is that there is an effect of what speech you allow and what speech you don't allow. And if you take a stand as Imam Ali did after the time of Uthman, it seems like a very harsh stance, that if there is a single penny that was unjustly spent, then I will take it and I will put it where it deserves to go. Not because he wanted to cause bloodshed, but because he wanted to say that I want to tell people that theft and crimes, and especially crimes by the government, do not pay. And we look forward by looking backward and righting the wrongs of the past. It makes a difference for us to know what is right and what is not right, and to take a stance. That doesn't mean we impose our opinion on other people. But it does mean that we don't say that whatever you believe is up to you and it doesn't matter what you believe. Another example from the time of our first Imam, Ali ibn Abi Talib, pertains to the month of Ramadan. People came in the time of Imam Ali, they said we want to do Taraweeh prayers. Every caliph appoints the people who are going to lead Taraweeh prayers. Who do you appoint? And Imam Ali said, Taraweeh is not part of the Sunnah of the Prophet. You yourself know it's not the Sunnah of the Prophet. And we're not going to appoint anybody. Pray at home like the Prophet told you to pray. And then there was a commotion, and people said, Wa sunnata umara, wa sunnata umara. And they gathered together, and Imam Ali sent his son, Imam Hassan, went to the masjid and began telling people to disperse. But then when the commotion was such that people were ready to rebel against the teachings of Imam Ali, then he said that I'm not going to compel you. I have told you what is the sunnah. If you continue to practice the wrong practice, then it is going to be your loss and your harm. So you take a stand and you inform people what is right, and you try to implement a just and proper policy to prevent people from utilizing religion for their own ends. That is why we care about what is right within Islam and what is not right. But it doesn't mean that we then impose what is right. So let me give a few examples, and then inshallah I will move on to reasons in the Quran and from our own practice about why it is important for us to establish the proper relationship to Ahlul Bayt alayhimu salatu wassalam. Sallu ala Muhammad. I mentioned one example yesterday, which is that there are some people who praise Nusayris, and we believe that praise is not something that is proper. And I repeat this message because every one of us should take a stand. If you hear that poetry, if you hear something like that in a gathering, a Facebook post, wherever it may be, if it is something that is against the basic teachings of Islam, then try not to pass it over in silence. You don't need to provoke a fight. But if you can, in a gentle way and in a nice way, assert that this is not something that is proper, this is not something that is constructive, then take a stand. And don't just let it pass in silence. Unless saying something is going to do more harm, and then Islam doesn't say to pick a fight for no reason where it's not going to have a benefit. Another example we have is a controversy which has recently become more common. Instead of saying that Imams are born, some people say that Imams are revealed or they have a zuhur. Some of you may have heard this, that Imam ki viladat nahi hoti, Imam ka zuhur hota hai, Imam ka nuzul hota hai. So this is a needless controversy, but what are the harms of it? First of all, zuhur is something that we are praying for. This is something that we ask Allah, that we are concealed from our Imam and our Imam is concealed from us. Oh Allah, hasten the zuhur and the appearance of the Imam. When I say that every Imam has a zuhur, it dilutes the concept of the zuhur of the Imam. And second of all, it destroys the whole purpose of our relationship to the Imams. The Quran is a perfect book. That's not something so surprising for me to say, that Allah, an infinite God, a perfect God, has a perfect book. The miracle of the Quran is not that it is perfect. An infinite God, of course He's going to have an infinite and a perfect book. The miracle of the Quran is that Allah took that perfect book from Lawh Mahfuz and He put it in an imperfect language that you and I can understand. That is the miracle of the Quran, that it came in human terms and its perfection was not diluted. In a language that you and I can understand, and its miraculousness was preserved. The miracle is not the perfection. The miracle is that it came in human terms. Similarly, Ahlul Bayt, they are nur. They are at a much higher level than the human level. Their existence is before the bodily creation of Adam alayhi salam, which means the physical creation of a human being. But that's not something that's special. It's not surprising that Allah could create a perfect nur when Allah is Nurus Samawati wal Ard. The beauty is that Allah brought that nur into human form. And then there is a person who eats and drinks and is born and dies and maintains that same perfection that Allah created in the time before Adam was even created. जब लोग कहते हैं ना मेरा अकीदा है कि इमाम की विलादत नहीं होती, ज़ुहूर होता है, इमाम की तौहीन है। क्यों तौहीन है? क्योंकि इमाम का ज़ुहूर, इमाम के नूर का ज़ुहूर, उसमें कमाल और मोजिज़ा नहीं है। मोजिज़ा यह है कि वो नूर इलाही, वो नूर जो अल्लाह ने मासूमीन को अता किया, उनके इंसानी जिस्मानी वजूद के अंदर डाल के एक इंसान कामिल के तौर पे जमीन पे पैदा किया. This is what you read in Ziyarat. Ashhadu annakum kuntum nuran fil aslab ash-shamikha wal arham al-mutahhara. You were light. That's the words of Ziyarat. It's not controversial. You were light, but then you were placed in pure wombs and purified loins. Wombs and loins means that you were born, that you are going to live a human life, and that you will die. That's the beauty of what Allah did. To take the ocean and to put the ocean in a single vase without diminishing the ocean at all. When you say that I'm going to deny that miracle of God, you're insulting Ahlul Bayt. Just like if you say the Quran is not text. That's not praise of the Quran, to say that it's in Lawh Mahfuz. The praise of the Quran is that it is text that you read and I can look at it. And it still has that perfection, which is in Lawh Mahfuz. The beauty of the Imams is not that they are nur. It is not that they have a zuhur or a nuzul. It is that they are born and they die. And through their lives they represent the greatest attributes of human beings. Sallu ala Muhammad. Now, some people answer in a different way. They say, Aimma ka zuhur nahi hota. आइम्मा का नुज़ूल नहीं होता. मैं ये नहीं अर्ज़ कर रहा, मैं कह रहा हूँ कि ये मसला ही नहीं है और इसको कोई इस पर इख्तिलाफ नहीं होना चाहिए. कमाल ये है कि उनकी विलादत होती है और यही फजीलत है और यही कमाल है. अब ज़ुहूर होता है या नहीं होता, ये हमारी बहस नहीं है कि इस पर हम वक्त जाया करें और दूसरों का वक्त जाया करें। सल्लल्लाहु अलैहि मोहम्मद। So take a stand. Even if people come to you and they say Allah Hafiz, now people have a habit of saying Allah Hafiz. I always insist on saying Khuda Hafiz. Not because I have anything against the word Allah. Allah is the name of Allah, and we say Allah with great pride. But because there is a reason why people insist on saying Allah Hafiz instead of Khuda Hafiz. And the reason why they say it is what is harmful. Take a stand not because everything is a matter of just one issue. There are reasons why people raise issues, sometimes they don't even realize it. And when people raise those issues in order to say that anything that comes from our culture is negative and anything that comes from another culture is better, then that is something that has many harms. So if you say Ramazan Mubarak and somebody responds Ramazan Kareem, Ramazan Kareem is great, Ramazan Mubarak is great. But don't deny your own culture, your own language, your own habit just because something is from a different society. Don't forget your family just because there is something that is shinier or fancier, unless it is a matter of right and wrong. God, Khuda, Allah, they all refer to the same being. If somebody wants to say Allah because they like saying Allah in English, great. But if somebody says Allah because they think God is somebody else, then insist on saying God and don't say Allah, to prevent that false impression from taking root. You can say God and you're referring to God. There is no reason to feel that this is an inferior work. These are messages that have a great deal of harm. In the time of Shaykh Ansari more than 200 years ago, that was a time when the government of Najaf was the Ottoman Sunni government. The governor of Najaf said that I am going to ban the Shia adhan. Ashhadu anna aliyan waliyullah. Because of disputes to unity, and this was the habit in parts of the Muslim world, that Islam was taken to default to the Sunni law, even in Shia areas. So Shaykh Ansari sent a message to the governor that I am going to exile myself from the city if you do this. And the city, because Shaykh Ansari was like Sayyid Sistani is today in Najaf, the marja of the Shia. When he said, I'm going to exile myself to Iran, then ulama, students, zuwar, many other people, even the tribes may have gone with him. That would have been a major disaster for the economy and even for the political stability of the Ottoman government. The governor said, I take back my command. One of the students of Shaykh Ansari came to Shaykh Ansari. He said, what is the big deal? Your own fatwa is that Ashhadu anna aliyan waliyullah is not part of the adhan. And if somebody says this with the intention of the adhan, their adhan is batil. It's invalid. Now when the governor says you can't say Ashhadu anna aliyan waliyullah, you say it's such an important issue that you'll leave the city. And Shaykh Ansari said the issue is not whether it is part of the adhan or not part of the adhan. I issued my fatwa because I looked at the Quran and the ahadith of Ahlul Bayt, and this is my conclusion. It should be a matter for the followers of Ahlul Bayt and their scholars to determine what is the message of Ahlul Bayt, not something that is imposed for other reasons from the outside. If something that I consider not to be part of the adhan is going to be opposed on the Shia from an outside source, then I will insist on it. And that process of reform must come from within, and it must come organically, not for the wrong reasons and not to be imposed. That is the principle that I am discussing. To take a stand for what is right, but in a way that allows gradual process of reform. So why is it so important to have Ahlul Bayt? That is the question that we have as Shia. Salat, zakat, charity, good manners, that doesn't require you to believe in Ahlul Bayt, to believe that. In fact, many of the virtues that you and I believe in for Ahlul Bayt, somebody says that this is the practice of the second caliph. He turned off his candle and said that this is my private money. And some of you, if you've ever attended a khutbah, then you've heard those fada'il of Ahlul Bayt that truly belong to Ahlul Bayt, they're attributed to somebody else. What does it matter if somebody says that this is Umar who did it or Ali who did it, alayhi salam, because both of them are telling you a story that is intrinsically good. The answer to that comes many years before Islam in the prayer of Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam in Surah Ibrahim. He says, رَبَّنَا إِنِّي أَسْكَنْتُ مِنْ ذُرِّيَّتِي بِوَادٍ غَيْرِ ذِي زَرْعٍ عِنْدَ بَيْتِكَ الْمُحَرَّمِ رَبَّنَا لِيُقِيمُوا الصَّلَاةِ. Prophet Ibrahim says that, "O Allah, I have brought my young progeny, Ismail alayhi salam and Hajar, to this area that has no vegetation, near your sacred house." So he mentions the house, the Kaaba. رَبَّنَا لِيُقِيمُوا الصَّلَاةِ. O Lord, so they can establish prayer. He mentions salat. فَاجْعَلْ أَفْئِدَةً مِّنَ النَّاسِ تَهْوِي إِلَيْهِ. No. إِلَيْهَا. No. إِلَيْهِمْ. He mentions the house. He could have said, "Oh Allah, make people's hearts incline to the house." فَاجْعَلْ أَفْئِدَةً مِّنَ النَّاسِ تَهْوِي إِلَيْهِ. But he didn't make that prayer. He mentions salah, prayer. He could have said, "Oh Allah, فَاجْعَلْ أَفْئِدَةً مِّنَ النَّاسِ تَهْوِي إِلَيْهَا." Make their hearts incline to prayer. But he didn't make that dua either. He said, "Oh Allah, I brought them to the house. I brought them for prayer. Make people's hearts love them so that they can teach people how to pray." That tells us that what is important is not the building of the Kaaba. What is important is not that Muslims pray and fast, but what is important is that Muslims have the leadership of Ahlul Bayt so that they can see how to bring the totality of the teachings in Islam into their lives. Another example is, how do you even know how to pray? The Quran tells you in detail how to do wudu. إِذَا قُمْتُمْ إِلَى الصَّلَاةِ. The Quran says, فَاغْسِلُوا وُجُوهَكُمْ وَأَيْدِيَكُمْ وَامْسَحُوا بِرُؤُوسِكُمْ وَأَرْجُلَكُمْ إِلَى الْكَعْبَيْنِ. The Quran tells you in detail how to do wudu. But prayer, which is more important, the Quran doesn't tell you when to do it or how to do it. Not the timings of each prayer, only mentioned in general, bukratan wa asila, but not in detail. How many rak'ah? Where is tashahhud? Where is qira'ah? Where is ruku'? Where is sujood? Nothing is mentioned. It's more important. Where does prayer come from? وَمَا آتَاكُمُ الرَّسُولُ فَخُذُوهُ وَمَا نَهَاكُمْ عَنْهُ فَانْتَهُوا. صَلُّوا كَمَا رَأَيْتُمُونِي أُصَلِّي. नबी की अदाओं का नाम है namaz. Prayer is not something that comes from the Quran. It is something that the Quran says take from the Prophet. What the Prophet does, look at him and imitate him. That is your worship. It is the Prophet who is the prayer. And your prayer is an imitation of the Prophet. Prayer is not the essence. إِنَّ الصَّلَاةَ تَنْهَى عَنِ الْفَحْشَاءِ وَالْمُنْكَرِ. Prayer brings you to a certain result. It prevents you from fahsha and munkar because it makes you like the Prophet. The goal is to imitate the Prophet and become like him in humility and in worship, not just to do these actions. And so if you say the essence of Islam is salah, then you have missed the point. Surah Al-Mu'minun does not say قَدْ أَفْلَحَ الْمُؤْمِنُونَ الَّذِينَ يُصَلُّونَ. It says قَدْ أَفْلَحَ الْمُؤْمِنُونَ الَّذِينَ هُمْ فِي صَلَاتِهِمْ خَاشِعُونَ, who are humble in their prayer. And if you're not humble in your prayer, then your prayer is not going to give you that. But don't abandon the prayer. Become humble and pray. But the point is that the prayer is a means to a greater end, which is to be like the Prophet. Those people who say we're not going to pray, they're not like the Prophet or like Ahlul Bayt. Those people who say we're going to pray and that's all we need, that's not what Allah wanted from you. He wanted you to pray to become like him. He wanted you to do Hajj to come close to them. He wanted you to give zakat so that you can support their cause. Everything has a human dimension. Now, very briefly, why is that human dimension so important? We'll expand on this further tomorrow, but just very briefly today, Sallu ala Muhammad wa alihi. Arrogance is something that is possible as a risk for every human being. And we are always at risk for becoming self-satisfied and arrogant. In my experience traveling to communities in the American scene, what I have seen most common as the source of division in communities is people feeling that Islam is dependent on them. And I'm not going to accept myself or ulama. It might be an alim who says that without me this community is nothing. I have the knowledge, I have the experience, and that's true, you have the knowledge that other people might not have, but that should make you humble. Just like the knowledge made the followers of the Imams humble before the Shia whom they would guide. Sometimes it is people with wealth. They say that I don't have to take this nonsense from these people. How much do they contribute? I give $10,000 a year, they give $200 a year, and then they tell me that they're my equals. This is something which is, if you go to Houston, you'll find that many centers, they break up because 4 or 5 wealthy people, physicians or business people or other people, that we don't need to take this nonsense. We can do our own thing. And then they're able to become independent because they don't need, so they feel independent. Just like an alim might become arrogant. Sometimes it's academic arrogance. When I first went to the University of Chicago, there was a world-renowned professor, Professor Fred Donner, 70 years old at that time. I said, Professor Donner, I want to take your class. He said, please call me Fred. There is that. And then there are people, if you tell somebody that, Fred, can I ask you for some advice? They say, well, it's Mr. Donner. Call me doctor, call me by my professional title, call me by what my affiliation is. So there are all kinds of people. Using a title is not bad. Being grateful for Allah giving you knowledge or wealth or intelligence is not bad. But what generally causes that arrogance is that we have acquired a ni'mah that is beyond our capacity. I will become arrogant if I have studied 5 years of Islamic studies and everyone else does not know as much as I do. But if everyone around me is a mujtahid and I have studied 5 years, I'm not going to become arrogant. If I have $150,000 a year salary and everyone around me has a $50,000 a year salary, I have the potential to become arrogant. Not everybody becomes arrogant, but there is the risk. But if everyone around me is earning $500,000 a year, then I'm probably not going to be arrogant. Not that being more knowledgeable makes you arrogant, but the risk is there. Right. I am something. I was speaking with a fundraiser for very useful, I won't name the project in Houston, a very wealthy man himself from the family of Pir Muhammad Ibrahim Trust in Pakistan, if you remember, the descendant of one of the descendants of Pir Muhammad Ibrahim, very wealthy in a very religious family, for those of you who know. And he was saying that when we were fundraising for our project in Houston, we found that people with an average income of $150,000 gave us a greater donation than people with an average income of $500,000. You go to somebody with income of $500,000, you'd think they would have more disposable income. Their donation is $500. You go to somebody with $150,000 income, their donation is $5,000. He said, we thought about it, and we found that there are always exceptions. But he said that we thought about it, and what we reached the conclusion is that people have a different psychological makeup depending on their income. The donation does not depend on how much money they have. It depends on where they're classing themselves and who they're comparing themselves with. And so once your needs become a higher order needs, you feel poor, even if other people might say that you're blessed. Those people who still feel that they are connected to the mainstream, they also contribute similarly. Those people who feel that they are in a different class, then all of a sudden there are many more temptations that they have. What Ahlul Bayt have given us is a solution that prevents us from demonizing the rich or demonizing the poor, from demonizing the educated or demonizing the uneducated, from any kind of polarization that might exist. Islam has said, look at those people who have perfected their humanity and have reached every perfection, and compare yourselves to them. You went from probation to a full-time job. You went from being an assistant to being a manager. You went from being a doctorate to a postdoctorate. You went from being a graduate to a fellowship to a good career, whatever you may accomplish in this world. You went from being barely practicing to doing all your wajibat to your nawafil. Whatever you may accomplish, compare yourself not to somebody less than you, because then you risk becoming arrogant. You risk becoming complacent. You risk thinking that you are somebody, and Islam depends on you. Compare yourself to Ahlul Bayt. Imam Ali was rich or poor? It's a trick question. Because in terms of income, Imam Ali was richer than Uthman and Talha and Zubayr and everybody who thought that they were very wealthy. When people started claiming that Imam Ali is poor, he told his treasurer that for a few months, don't distribute the funds that we normally distribute and collect them in a house. Then he invited all of those people over to his house. And it was filled with dirhams and dinars. And they said, Ya ibn Abi Talib, liman hadhihi al-amwal? Who does this money belong to? He says, هذا مال من لا مال له. This is the wealth and the income of that same person whom you thought did not have any income. Now Imam Ali was not embarrassed, and he was not showing off his wealth. People said he was poor because they were giving a message. He's not qualified to manage the millions of dollars, the millions of dirhams and dinars that are going to come in revenue for the Muslim world. Because he's never managed anything bigger than a simple house with one room and simple bread. And so Imam Ali said, if you think that is the case, then know that I have a greater income than all of you. You're building an empire, buying property after property, village after village, farm after farm, and embarking in worldly trade. I am building my akhir. I can manage it better than you, but my world is my bridge to the hereafter. And your hereafter is just an excuse for you to build this world. And then the Imam says, go and distribute it because I don't need it. So it's not about proving anything to people, but removing that misunderstanding. We as Shia are cured from arrogance if we have Ahlul Bayt. I might become a mujtahid, I might become a marja', I might become a scholar, but if I recognize that I am a follower of Ahlul Bayt, then I am nothing. Whoever I may be, nothing. If your hero is Abu Hanifa, maybe somebody today is more learned than Abu Hanifa. It's entirely possible that many of the Sunni scholars today are more learned than Abu Hanifa. But if your hero is Imam Ja'far Sadiq, you can be 10 times more learned than Abu Hanifa, but you will say, I am nobody. You might be wealthy. You might be able to accomplish any worldly desire or whim you may have. But if your ideal is Imam Ali, then you will always say that I am less than him and I have nothing. And even if I want to spend all of my considerable wealth in the way of Allah, I will not be able to build those wells, to care for those widows, to raise those orphans, to help the world, to help the needy and the vulnerable, as Imam Ali did. Millions of dollars to you will feel like nothing, and you will feel that you need to do more, not that you are somebody. Why? Because you are a Shia of Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam.
محمد وآل محمد.
And this is the greatest blessing that Allah can give you, pure from arrogance. In fact, the Quran says that the closest people in affection to the believers will be Christians. It's interesting that out of all of the religious communities, Allah says that Christians will be closer to the believers. Although if you look at Islamic law is closer to Jewish law. They have from birth, I won't mention the specific laws that are relevant, but until death. There are very great similarities between ghusl, diet, even prayer, worship, burial, so many other things, much more so than between Muslims and Christians. That's not what gives them the closeness though. Why does the Quran say that? Because Christian religion, even though it doesn't have fiqh, even though it has mixed shirk within its theology, but it emphasizes humility. And because it emphasizes humility, وَأَنَّهُمْ لَا يَسْتَكْبِرُونَ, they will be the ones who are closest to believers. Greatest blessing that Allah can give you is to save you from arrogance. And you and I have the best means of protection from arrogance because we have a connection to the greatest human beings who lived. That is a gift that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us. And this is why it is important not to look down on those other four categories of people who call themselves Muslims or are Muslims. Not to judge, not to condemn, not to deny other people their religious freedom, but to proclaim that we are proud of this connection to Ahlul Bayt. Because the purpose of prayer is to make us khashi' and humble. The goal of religion is to remove istikbar from us. The goal of religion is to see us as vessels for a greater purpose, to feel a connection to our believers when they are ignorant, not to feel superior to them when they are ignorant.
Subhanallah.
And that happens if you have an inspiration of Ahlul Bayt, alayhim as-salatu was-salam. And you can see that difference in the life of Ahlul Bayt. Sometimes people say that, why do you make such a big deal about the martyrdom of Imam Ali? The second caliph was also martyred. I don't know if you ever had that discussion that some Muslims, they will say, well, if Imam Ali was martyred and stabbed, then wasn't the second caliph also stabbed? And I won't get into a long discussion about the differences. That could be a long discussion. But just one point. Read the biography of the second caliph and Imam Ali. As soon as the second caliph was stabbed, according to history, he said, دُونَكُمُ الْكَلْبِ فَإِنَّهُ قَدْ قَتَلَنِي. Go and grab that dog, he has killed me. That was the first word out of the mouth of the second caliph when he was stabbed. And then Imam Ali, when he was stabbed, the first words out of his mouth were, فُزْتُ بِرَبِّ الْكَعْبَةِ. Oh Allah, I thank you that you have finally blessed me with shahada and martyrdom that I have prayed for so long. Imam Ali was brought to his home, and he was between unconsciousness and consciousness, unable to even keep his head and his body steady. And then, after some period of unconsciousness, Imam Ali opened his eyes, and he saw that the Muslims had captured Ibn Muljam and tied his hands and his feet, and that he was in the same room as Imam Ali. Imagine Imam Ali struck with a sword, poison coursing through his veins, unable to even keep his head steady, his body changing color to a pale yellow, and he sees Ibn Muljam, and he sits up And he says, "Oh, my son Hassan, what has happened to my killer? Why is his body shaking and why are his hands and feet bound so tightly? Loosen the rope and bring him some water. He is your captive. And even if he is my murderer, he is in my house, and we are Ahlul Bayt. When he is in my house, then he should eat and drink what you eat and drink. He should not have his hands and feet bound. He should not shake in fear. If I die, then you have the right to kill him with a single blow. But so long as I am alive, no harm should come to him." This is the character of Imam Ali, which is why we do not compare him to anyone else in human history, and why we mourn him and take pride in our love for Imam Ali. But if we have that love for Imam Ali from such a distance, without ever having seen him, without ever having heard him, without ever having been in his presence, imagine the Shia of Kufa when they heard the sound of Jibreel. تهدمت والله أركان الهدى قتل علي المرتضى. The very foundations and pillars of guidance have broken apart. Ali Murtada has been killed. It is said that that day people didn't remember whether they prayed Fajr or didn't pray Fajr. They ran from wherever they may have been. Those who were in the masjid came to the house of Imam Ali. Those who were in their own homes, those who were sleeping, they came and they surrounded, and multitude upon multitude of people were gathered around the house of Imam Ali, crying, weeping, praying, asking Allah that, "Oh Allah, shorten our lives, but do not take Imam Ali from us. Oh Allah, we offer ourselves, we offer our families, we offer our children, whatever may be needed to preserve the life of Imam Ali." It is said that Imam Hassan sent for a physician to come, a surgeon who was known for treating difficult wounds. He came to the house of Imam Ali. He did an examination and he saw that the wound had reached the brain of the Imam, and the brain of the Imam was visible through his skull. And then when people asked him, "Tell us, is there any hope of recovery?" Although that surgeon was not a Muslim, he was so overcome with grief that he did not provide an answer but began to weep. And people realized that this meant that there was no human hope of recovery. They began to cry, and Imam Hassan came out of the house. He said, "O Shia of my father, I know that you are in grief, and we are also in grief, but there are my sisters Zainab and Kulthum in the house. When they hear you mourning, then they are not able to bear their own grief. Please lower your voices so that my sisters can have some peace." For a few moments, the crowd also lowered its voice, and Imam Ali was with his family, alone with his family. At one time, when he came out of a stupor, out of his unconsciousness, it is said that Imam Ali saw his two sons, Imam Hassan and Imam Hussein, standing over him. They were weeping, and their tears fell on the body and on the head of Imam Ali. And the Imam said, "My sons, I tell you to have patience. I tell you to keep your tears so that you can be a source of strength for your family and my family. My sons, I tell you, if it gives you peace." And here the Imam said the one thing that could have given some consolation to Imam Hassan and Imam Hussein. He said that just now when I had closed my eyes, I saw that your grandfather, the Prophet, and your mother, Fatima Zahra, were coming into this very room, and they are welcoming me after such a long separation back into their own presence. And then the Imam said, that I ask you not to shed tears in front of your sisters. At that moment, Zainab ibn Kulthum came into the room, the same Imam who told his sons to have patience. When he saw Zainab ibn Kulthum, he began to weep himself, and he said that I cannot bear to see this grief on the face